Okay, hello, good evening. I just heard we're live. Good, thank you very much for joining and being so numerous here tonight. And thank you very much for playing the game of breaking the traditional relationship between the tribune and the ground floor. This is the intent of tonight's PK Talks. Again, I would like to thank very much to all those who contributed to the exhibition, whose work is being shown here until the 17th of January. And I will introduce our moderator or our conversator today. That's pure Spanish, but I don't know if that works. Who will have a conversation not only with contributors, but hopefully also with the audience. I already introduced something about the exhibition, so I will not go there. I think that this is something that is up to you and Robert to discuss later. I have a little note that I need to introduce, is that we are releasing tonight a small publication that gathers all the works that were presented in our previous exhibition, Site Situations. So we have printed out a few publications, a few issues, and all those who participated in the exhibition will get a copy later. So it's a simple one, it's a simple publication, but still it gathers everything that we do, and we will do the same also with the exhibition that we are opening today. So please stay until the end of the BK Talks. That was also a marketing trick. You stay until the end of the BK Talks so that the public is more numerous. I'm going to show you a little bit my relationship with maps before we give the floor to Robert. Okay? So for me, maps are modes of intervening, of modes of relating to the public or to the different publics. So I will show you a few of the works that I have undertaken together with the Y Factory. The first one is Le Grand Basel. This is the work that we are presenting today in the exhibition. What we did is a workshop that had to do, that was organized by Manifesta 13. Manifesta, I don't know if you know what it is. It's an art biennial that every 2 years is celebrating a different city in Europe. What Manifesta doesn't want is a classical biennial that doesn't have so much to do with the cities where they go. But we were appointed, together with MVRTV and the Y Factory, the directors of the urban studies that take place before the curators show their work or decide where their work goes in the city. So we mapped Marseille. And this is what we did with our students systematically, was to give them a template and try to understand what the city was like from many different points of view. Any layer would be interesting. Any question would be also good. So this is what we did. We mapped systematically everything we do until having a sort of quick and clear picture of what the city was about, no? So in this system, or in this, what we do at the Y Factory always is something, is systematics, no? Try to replicate a certain template. Then later, what we also try to do is not only ask our students, but our different stakeholders that have to do with the fabrication of the city of Marseille, what their city was like. And we gave them yet another template, which is what you see here. It's the same template we gave the students. And they drew their own cartographies of the city. This is what the city was like for them. This is the, let's say, these are the spaces of the daily lives, no? So we combined them all as well. And then finally, we compared Marseille to a lot of other port cities that can be compared to it, no? In order to have even a better picture within the European context. And this is the cartographies that came out later, no? What you see here is that we systematically tried to map everything. We finally produced all these maps, and this is the first let's say, point of departure of trying to intervene, trying to propose new ideas for a certain city, in this case Marseille. And we built a map. This is what the whole exercise was about, was to build a map. And we built this giant map in this great building. This is the scale of it, where students were invited to put their own interventions. And these interventions were actually the result of those maps that they have produced. These are some of the images of those interventions. We always work with the same materials. It's map and phone. You will see it later, no? And then we had the chance to discuss with not only with the students, but also with the public. And this is something that I've been trying to explore in the last decade, no? How do we actually communicate a certain idea or certain ideas of interventions to different publics, not only scholars, not only academia, etc., but let's say to the citizenships, no? To the citizens who finally decided to keep working on those ideas for Marseille that we produce with or on that map, no? And this is, anyway, some of the ideas. Then we put them together and then we try to sort them out, no? And this is the result of trying to combine in different topics. This is the idea of sorting, no? Sorting ideas onto that map to finally produce this thing or this map, which is a cartography of past, present, and future Marseille, according to the ideas produced by the students, the interviews with the stakeholders, and everybody else who wanted to join the project, which is the map that you see here today in the exhibition. That's the methodology that we used. Then we employed more or less the same methodology in the Czech Republic. This happened last year with a lot of students from the Czech Republic and here the School of Delft. Again, the same template, no, or one template, and then we try to map, to understand a certain site with a certain situation, and then combine them, and then try to explore the entire country through all these maps. And then we put all these maps on the table, this on the wall, which is what you just saw in Marseille, and start producing yet another map of desires for the city of Marseille. Sorry, for the entire Republic, Czech Republic. No, so again, students are drawing on top of a map and producing this cartography of the future of the desire Czech Republic that they want. No, we took over this atrium of the main school, architecture school in Prague. What you see there is sort of a sacred building in concrete that all of a sudden has these people coming and posting or placing maps there. It was quite I would say, an intervention, no? It was an intervention that impacted the students there, and maybe impacted also the faculty also there. No? In the end, we end up performing with this map and playing with it. It's a very heavy map. I think if it wasn't because of, I think Simon is around here, I don't know how we would have hanged it. But this performance with music, etc., let the students try to show what their ideas were for the future of their own country. The map stayed much longer than I thought. I thought it would fall apart. But anyway, that's the map, no, of Marseille. So again, cartography, mapping, etc., making maps. Then we took over the next atrium, and then what we did was to have a similar exercise that we just saw in Marseille, interventions, no? What are the ideas for the Czech Republic that can be placed as a model, as a physical one, on the map of the Czech Republic, no? So again, trying to trigger certain discussions, not only with the students, but also with the citizenship, and start to engage in conversations, not only among us, which I think is something really important and interesting to do, is how do we engage with other publics, no? How do we transmit or communicate everything we do or we say to others outside who may have more difficulties to understand the ideas that we have, no? So these are moments of that presentation in which, as I said, we try to communicate certain ideas for the country, no? This is the video that was produced finally in the by the Y Factory here in Delft, and again, how do you place all those ideas on a map? No, this idea of mapping is recurrent, and this is what we finally produce. The map or the video goes on and on, but as you can understand, there is certain ideas placed on a map, on different contexts, on different regions, because of certain reasons, which it would take too long to explain, but I guess that everybody understands this idea of the map as a base of everything that we're doing, no? The map. So one of the other things that we have been more and more concerned about is not only the city or the country, but the entire planet, no? And we have started making cartographies or trying to map the urgency, no? Urgent Earth, as I call, no? And what are the urgencies? What do we need to do about it? And how do we design according to certain scenarios? So from a city or a country, we move into the entire globe and produce different scenarios for the entire planet, no? These are cartographies produced, again, by our our students systematically with the template. That's a methodology that we generally tend to use. And what are the resulting worlds according to different scenarios. They tested in total, I think, about 28. And then we show it. And then we try to communicate. And then we try to engage with different publics. Again, that's something that really interests me for quite a while. How do we, let's say, communicate everything we do, everything we say here to others, no? How do we bring these maps to others? How do we say, we show others, those that take decisions, what is it that we are thinking of, no? What the urgencies are, etc., etc. She is now gone, but he is probably coming back. So this is something that we need to address, no? How do we actually communicate those voters that take the decision of sending their envelope and decide that they want somebody with a certain hair in their ruling their countries, no? This is, we did something, this is very, very, very quickly done, no? But when you decide what is it that you want to do according to certain information, you have a map which is more or less gray with red dots, no? And with very few blue areas. And then just very quickly done, and of course this is like thick brush. Then you put the 10 more important universities of the Netherlands on top of that map. And that makes places like Delft, Leiden, etc. look like very small Gaulois villages surrounded by the Grey Empire. All right? So I think this is something I think this is something very, let's say, preliminary to take more to say decisions, but this is food for thought, no? How much are we actually disseminating or communicating certain information to others so that they make some decisions or other decisions, no? In the end, I'm afraid of this. I'm afraid of all these people or all these men with bad hair ruling us, no? And this is not about cartography anymore, but somebody told me today that this is about cartography, no? So I know it's a bad joke, but I love it. But so in the end, no, how do we communicate all the academic knowledge, or how do we transfer it to others that in the end make these decisions before these people with this very bad hair take over? Anyway, this is how I haven't always understood maps, and this is how I have always worked with them. So tonight, I'm going to give the word to Robert Gurney. I have a little note here about Robert. He's going to introduce or conduct the conversation tonight. Robert is a transdisciplinary scholar, theorist, and lecturer at the academic group of Architecture, Philosophy, and Theory at the Faculty of Architecture. Probably you all know him, but I'm happy to read this because sometimes, it's not so easy to be there where he is. He has been teaching and coordinating courses focusing on theory and research methodology since 2015. He's also one of the contributors to the exhibition with his cartography of discourses that is there. So without further ado, I'm going to give the word to Robert so that you can keep going. Thank you very much, Robert. I think you need to use this. Thanks.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm super happy to be here and being volunteer to try out this new format. We already see a form of pattern formation where I ended up being, the one person instead of the 5 that we usually have. So I hope that the dynamic is actually going to be a bit different later, and that we're actually going to turn around a little bit and try out maybe different kind of constellation of talking with each other. Because I think we talk about something that we all love, no? We like what we all do, and in different ways, I think becomes very much part of architectural education right now, transgressing a little bit the scope of building and looking more at environments. And of course, then suddenly the buildings, the things that we design suddenly are situated in landscapes, are situated in cultural contexts, are situated somewhere else. So we put buildings on the map and we try to understand what we can do by reconstituting the context in which it takes place. And in that regard, I think maps become a fundamental part of our design and research methodology. At the same time, maybe it's also something that we don't necessarily give enough space to talk about as such in detail. And so just to be very clear in terms of the words that we use, I would just wanted to start maybe, why does that? Maybe it activated like an auto thing. I just wanted to maybe clarify the very brief distinction between mapping, maps, and cartography. And in the basic sense, remind everyone that cartography is basically the practice and the result of this practice of making maps, and as well the wider discipline that it constitutes, including the methodology, theory, and history of that very practice. And of course, that is something that I think in an academic context, and if we talk about context, it's even more important to keep in mind, that we don't necessarily see the map just as an object, as an artifact, potentially representing a static kind of entity, landscape, space, whatever, but that maps are always the outcome of a process. They are also an outcome of a historical kind of process. And in that regard, I think it's also important to maybe think about then about the title about the exhibition. When we talk about new maps, I don't know what it does. Yeah? But then how do I click the next one? When we talk about, let's say, new maps, it sounds like a little bit that there's a danger of maybe reinventing the wheel. No, what would we even need with new maps? What is actually new? Is the map new, or is the practice in which we produce them new? Is the context in which maps are made new? Is there a new disciplinary context? Is there a new theory behind it? And I think in that regard, as a wannabe historian, my personal thing is always to look back in history and look a little bit at like where do these tools come from, and also look outside our own scope. And in that regard, my personal fascination with maps actually comes with these kind of things. There are stick maps, for example, that Micronesians have used to navigate the Pacific Ocean. And of course, they're wonderful artifacts, but in a thing, they have nothing to do with maps as we traditionally conceive them. But you can clearly see that they are a practice, a technology that has something to do with understanding the world, creating a certain type of fabric that then also becomes a narrative device, becomes a mnemotechnic device in which people, in a sense, transmit knowledges, traditional knowledges. And in that regard, I think maps are really rich, and they transgress just spatial memory and spatial locations. And of course, there's something interesting then to think about the context in which we talk about the new is maybe like a decolonial context, where we need to maybe think about where our forms of mapping actually come from and how we have used them to construct the world. With me, I mean, with we, I just mean the West. So of course there is a very long history of people critically understanding maps as a way to, in a sense, discover the world. And of course, initially it has been done by traders who brought back these oral memories. And 1,000 years later, people put these memories into like a spatial kind of construct, reconstituting where all these places are. And of course, it was very inexact and potentially inaccurate because it's based on these oral histories and the huge temporal delay that underlay this form of spatial production. And the interesting thing, of course, is then to also be clear on, again, where, let's say, then the particular type of mapping comes from. And for example, here I just want to show the Cassini map from the 1700s, which was the first topographic map mapping all of France, in a process where there was a huge socioeconomic, political, and tax recomposition between people who owned land and who worked land and certain interests. And of course, we cannot forget the context of this map production. So in the same way as the map, in a sense, charts the world, I think a map can also always reveal the world in which it was produced. And I think these kind of relationships bring the focus much closer to, let's say, the processual aspects of making maps. And also when you see all the exhibits here, you see clearly there's an interest in this kind of critical understanding in not just using maps, but in also using maps in a specific way, including often aspects of time, temporal change, processes, and so on, intangible aspects. And I think that's where we thought let's say, where we use the collective knowledge today, right now, when we have the discussion, so that we don't necessarily describe so much the different projects that we do, but that we have more a kind of a meta-methodological discussion on what were the ambitions behind it, what have you tried out, to what degree do you think it is successful, and what have we learned from it, where do you think on? So that this becomes, let's say, a kind of a very interesting discussion between us, how we as architects, spatial designers and so on can use not just new maps, but also maps in new ways, how they connect with digitization, the increasing aspect of digital world becoming more intangible. Then the interesting thing about maps is, of course, that maps have a fundamentally amazing capacity to render visible things. At the same time, we also know that a huge problem of maps is once you render a map, you always need to omit something. So at the same time that maps render visible something, this something is always based on the rendering invisible of other things, other narratives, marginalized voices, and so on. And I think the interesting thing is here, I think there's also a few maps that have a counter-cartographic aspect already in it. There's a lot of things that try to render visible powers, for example, discourses, and so on. And that's maybe where I want to start to have the opening of the discussion. Where do you see in your own work that these maps really help, I don't want to say objectify, but put on the map something, like really render visible, give a space, spatialize, materialize things that otherwise would go unnoticed? So of course it's like always the most difficult thing is to open up the discussion. So, but if you want to start, I'm very happy, thank you. Maybe it's also always nice because we're such a big group, we don't necessarily know each other, if you also quickly say who you are.
Oh yeah. Just to skip the awkward silence before the first question. I'm Marijne. I graduated in 2021. And I produced that map, so that's easy, it's in view. Yeah, my thesis was about the ocean and that it's an urban and social space. And I think, you know, there's marine spatial planning, but there isn't marine urbanism. And I think part of that is because we don't see the materializing of the urban at the ocean. That's also because a lot of it is in movement, the water itself, but also the occupation of the ocean is often in movement. So this map shows all ships. Every ship traces a line, and more ships create warmer colors. So this actually shows not only that it's densely used, but also it shows patterns that we can read from. So it's a different way of looking at an ocean. And sometimes if we depict the ocean, it's empty, it's vast, but it's not always urban, and there's not always structure recognized in it. So I think it's nice to use a very simple method that already exists, ship tracking data, to unveil patterns and matter. Sort of matter.
Thank you. I mean, that's wonderful. What I just realized is what we want to avoid today is that, let's say, I don't want to always, let's say, ping pong the microphone. And if there's somebody also in the audience and you have a question, maybe just stand up or come to us, and then we can also, of course, always include your question. But I think what I want is, in a sense, also to have the discussion with each other. So if you also want to respond to each other, that would be the best modality in which this works.
I was actually checking the map that you produced, and if I understood correctly, you mentioned the potential of treating it more as an urbanism. And I was curious, what do you exactly meant by it? Because if I understood correctly, this is a shipment movement. So at this moment, it's more like a transportation route than urbanism in the sense of habitational space. at least for people. But that's what I'm curious about. How do you imagine this urbanism aspect happening there?
Yeah, there's many ways that you can define an urban space. It's partially occupation, but also habitat, but I guess it's also if we relate as humans to it, if we are dependent of it in a way. And there are many dependencies between humans and the ocean. And what I try to do with this map is also showing those, or trying to find those dependencies. So the village Hammerfest, or the town Hammerfest, is on there, and you can trace the lines going from that town towards the urban space, and from that you can sort of distinguish through what activities they are connected to the sea, and what will happen. In this case, it's heavily dependent on oil. What will happen if that oil goes away in a post-oil scenario, or when it moves further Arctic, when the ice melts? And it's not thought about it in a spatial matter yet, so this helps in that way. But there's probably many more ways to look at the ocean as an urban space, I think.
Maybe just a quick follow-up. Did you check whether there is an influence on the habitation of, like, natural habitation because of these routes? Like that something would happen in the ocean due to this density of routes?
I didn't check, but that's also because marine spatial planning sort of does that already. So marine spatial planning wants to see if functions that they plan somewhere have an effect on marine life and ecology, if they have an effect on economy and social factors. But only the social factors are really unrepresented in marine spatial planning in practice. So that's why I focused on that part.
Well, thank you very much. I really think the map is wonderful, but I want to kind of address more the general statement that Robert introduced to us. Because I think maps have a really wonderful potentiality for us to open up new worlds by factually relating data. And I think also your map is kind of, because nowadays with the GIS referencing or our possibility to almost become extraterrestrial yet at the same time terrestrial, by the kind of this process of mapping or finding methods, we kind of open up a sort of extraterrestriality, sort of as if we're kind of conceptual astronauts on our own planet. And what I think is really wonderful is then where the girth or like the materialization of that appears is the moment where this becomes sort of a world which has a logic, which has a sort of a resonance with itself. And it's most wonderful the moment this happens when you have never ever even thought that people were able to create, you know, even if you find a map that has these colonial powers in them, you kind of see the rigorousness of this type of system. But it's even more surprising nowadays with the sort of rigorousness of the systems or the complexity of them, that we even get very unexpected sort of worlds that arise not because they were planned, but because of multiple plannings happening at the same time and then creating a new one. And I think also that's where kind of the mapping practice today is very unique, in the sense that it doesn't really come from a power structure. We all have open source data that can be mapped, but it becomes kind of creating these infinite sort of worlds that are there. They are there, but they show us how sort of strange and particular and maybe sort of extraterrestrial or terrestrial occupation has become.
But still, I wonder if we're not pushing ourselves out of the equation, because it's still a rendering, even though you choose to portray it as a very well, data is always, let's say, always has a side to it, I think. And even more if you are the one that's in charge of, let's say, defining boundaries, defining what set of data. Like in her example, I think there are many other layers, and I know because there were other maps in your work, but there are many other layers which you could show there to, let's say, build the comprehensive picture. And even if you strive for the comprehensive picture, it's still your picture. So you're still talking from your perspective. And I think that you mentioned something which is control or maybe accuracy, like preciseness. And I think this is an interesting concept to think of because somehow if you let go of, let's say, graphic control, data control, preciseness, perhaps this is a way that we start questioning let's say the static, the totalitarian maybe view that a map brings. But I still don't think that we can exempt ourselves from, let's say, a role in the act of mapping. And
Louisa, I think what is interesting, as I say, in your project also, you also try to avoid that it is your map, no, by actually trying to map with things, non-human others or something, no? So it's more like a mapping with.
Yeah, and I think, well, he talked about this in speaking about maps precisely, but I think that it's also about looking at the built things or the material things and understanding them as channels of systems, of discourses. These are the points where we can almost grasp, and they have a set of meanings behind them. So, and it becomes chaotic and really to map out all these things that are flowing through. I don't remember exactly who it is, but I read something that says that things operate through landscape and not in them. So really understanding what is this overflow of systems that's, and what does this produce in terms of meanings and
I do agree with you that there is a positionality in the creation of the map that you can't exempt yourself. And also the accuracy, I think I always wanted to be, you know, I think I always say I wanted to be a physics professor, but I was very bad at math. So I understand also, like there, and also I understand there is a type of, maybe a godification, like a sort of, oh, this is gonna solve the map. This map made the map of a sort of a solver. But I think what you're also addressing is that, and I think we agree, maybe, I'm not sure, is that it doesn't really, it's maybe in the potentiality that of course you can keep mapping more and more layers, make it more and more complex, but then you also get to a point where you can't explore it anymore. And I think for me the beauty in a map is that also how you kind of digest a map as an artifact, right, is in looking at it and then exploring it by yourself, kind of wandering through it, kind of trying to relate it. Or don't you agree?
But you're really focusing on the map.
Yeah.
I don't really focus on the map as the product or as the thing. Like, I think the map is just a tiny part of it. I don't map to achieve a map. I map to achieve something else.
Sure, but it's part of it, no?
Yeah, but then are you trying to reach a moment where you freeze it in time and say, okay, I have a map now,
No,
and great,
no.
I have a map.
No, I think what I'm saying for me is, if I'm personally, from my process, a map becomes interesting architecturally when it starts to create a world that I can explore or uncover. And it doesn't mean that the world is my world, or that I have created this world, or that this is the final world, but it's more like, oh, that's an interesting connection. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. You're making things explicit.
Point of entry.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like this is how it is, but it's more like it uncovers sort of a thing that I've not been aware of before. And I think a map is a wonderful tool to kind of draw that and also communicate that with other people, and that you know, so that's also why the object becomes, I think, interesting. But yeah, of course, it's always...
again, like then determinacy, like preciseness, these all becomes things that I think we can play with in order not only to make it a tool that corresponds to, let's say, the things we're mapping. Like, for example, there I'm mapping very dynamic systems. I need to update that map almost, it needs to be a live map, kind of. But then I also think another thing is, indeed, and Robert mentioned this, how does this map become, Javier also mentioned it, something that can be apprehended outside of architecture, right?
Yeah, fair enough, yeah.
But I think we agree in the end.
Yeah,
we disagreed, and then we agreed
again. We kind of agree, yeah, no, I think we do. It's good to kind of unpack it.
Nico's wanted to say.
I just wanted to add something in the mix to make things even more complicated. I think, first of all, your point about the process of mapping and the map as an object. I think it's, there is always a risk that we associate the moment of agency and decision-making in the production process of the map, right? And we often forget, and we say, oh, the map is subjective because someone decided what to put on the map, right? But we often forget that the process of the construction of the data itself is also not very objective. We think that the data is neutral, but the map is subjective. But this is not necessarily the case. And there exists also an interesting dialectical relationship between the two, because basically, what data you're trying to collect depends on the idea that you have of the map that you want to make, right? Or the type of information or the theme.
Otherwise, you could never produce the map.
Correct. So the whole process is actually quite a subjective set of decisions. And I just want to, highlight the fact that the map is not the only area where we are taking these subjective decisions, where we are introducing agency. And you want to say something already?
Kind of open that little vent hole of...
Yes, I think mapping is always subjective because it is produced by somebody. But I don't want to make it more complicated, I want to make it more simple. But if you think about, if you know what Bruno Latour says, there's so many different people seeing the world in different realities. All of those realities are subjective. It becomes very theoretical now, but we do notice that now in politics, in all the issues that we're facing, it's very difficult to get everybody on the same side. I think a map collectively created can also work towards a more collective shared perspective of reality. And that's really needed to move forward. Of course, not everybody will be on the same side, but mapping together with stakeholders, for example, can be a huge step to create change. So maybe collectively mapping can be the solution for the problem that we're talking about.
I think that relates a bit to this idea of mapping with, no? So in a sense, it's not just you who selects the data, but the data, depending on how you assemble that together with others, basically selects even what you're able to convey in there, no? And I think in Luisa's work that's very clear. In a sense, it changes the categories. No, it changes actually the parameters you would use to apply that. And without putting Jonathan on the spot, but I think in your work it also becomes a lot clear, let's say, that the very categories that you use, what do you map, even is part of the contestation of the data, no, right now. And it's actually part of something that you need as a researcher to almost work through before you can even tell the story with the terms you would like it to, no? So I was wondering if you wanted to maybe reflect on the aspect of the objectivity of the data that you use there.
Yeah, various reflections, I guess. Also off your points related to the staticness of maps. I think we often get comfortable with a map and to say, okay, hands off, we have a beautiful map and it looks nice, and put it into an A4 and call it a day. So I think it should not ever start and end off with a map. And I really believe, especially in the context of my work, dealing with a systemic, unjust regime, like a state, where, data and information is not a privilege where you have mostly in the West. You oftentimes find, I was hopeless and lost with trying to find information because I was framed with this idea within this education system that we need to map. And we often have a very closed idea about what a map looks like. Like the references you showed from ages ago don't look like the maps that we're shown in our curriculums today. So it's kind of a critique on our courses and our education system to diversify how we visualize spatial relationships, because that's what a map is, right? So in my work, I think I always try to complement understanding a map through different scales of experiences. So whether it's photography or diagrams or other things, because it's, yeah, it oftentimes glazes over complexity, because maps also, as you see here, are very visually complex. So I often get lost in the map, and even in my own maps. And also in my work, you know, you have to almost, yeah, use map as one of the tools, and going through, like you say, the landscape of what you're trying to understand. You know, using social media or newspaper articles, or so yeah, we shouldn't get comfortable with mapping as a mode of visualizing the story. And also to Marline's point about collective mapping, I think it's also dangerous to perform those exercises because who's in that room and who's part of those processes is often under question. You often get focal groups or elitist kind of levels of knowledge holders, and yeah, people are just left out. So yeah, we should just think about and reflect on who's part of these processes of mapping and whose stories we're telling, right? And what privileges we are accentuating. Yeah.
I was like when I hear the word collective mapping, it actually also applies to the situation when I drew the map for the Hong Kong protest in 2019. And I'm not the only mapper during the protest. There are many other anonymous channels who did some maps as well. So it's actually a collective mapping of the same situation, maybe same event on the same corner of the city. And I realized that we are using different kind of graphic representation. Maybe I'm using a big circle for the police and protester, and then some use a little triangle, forming a line to representing, oh, there's a row of police there. But when you are from the viewpoint of the user, you are using your phone to access those maps, and if you get the scale wrong, or you are using too small elements to representing something, then they will have a trouble trying to read this in the middle of the tear gas or like police charging. So I think, yes, it could be dangerous for some matter or subject to map. For example, some very precise planning of the infrastructure, but maybe there are some other potential that maps can be used as a collective way, because in this event, there is so many things happening at the same time. So reading the city from different perspectives can also be helpful. Yeah, and also I like the discussion between you and him about the discourse of the maps, and also what is the limit of the maps, because I also experienced that from the protest. Like the limit of the maps can be very effective on the personal view, because you are just one person who doing all the things, and sometimes you can feel that the information is too overflow. So that is also one of the initiatives why collective map can be useful as well. Yeah, and also about the discourse and the social impact, I think it's also very important that maps can be accessible by the public, and then they can use that as an archive or a reflection on the history as well. Yeah, that's it for now. Yeah.
Hi, I believe you asked us once upon a time to introduce ourselves. My name is Christopher. I think a number of interesting points have come up, and one of the things that seems to be a recurring theme is this idea of the stasis of the map. And somehow the problem of the author and the reader, and the information that is somehow being brought across or not, and the way in which that is done is an interesting thing. And somehow we talk about the map as our tool, as if it's a sentence that we construct, and we say, oh yeah, sure, that's easy. But it's not so simple. I mean, of course, we have, even in the case of a sentence, we have certain words that we are choosing which suggest certain things, have certain nuances, and not only for myself, the words that I'm choosing, but also for each of the people that are listening somehow have a particular way of understanding those words. So there is a multiplicity, not only in my own production, but also the readership. I think, I mean, for my sake, we produced, I'm not sure where we are, I'm sorry, there are a few people back there. You know who you are, part of the Borders and Territories group. But our map of Panama is kind of gamifies the space. It's this massive one on the screen, yeah. And allows, therefore, somehow a distance between author and reader to take place where the 8 people that are reading the map simultaneously are engaged with each other in the space that they are reading the map. It somehow disconnects you from the space itself. We're not trying to make a map that is telling you where things are. It's not a navigational chart. But we're bringing together the banana, the cocaine, the conquistador, the Venezuelan migrant all into the same space. And so, thank you for those who played it earlier. I think in the space of 15 minutes, 1 person already died and about 4 people overdosed and had to wait for a couple of turns, which somehow gives an edge to the person who's playing as copper. And then, you know, so it allows for chance encounters to happen that cannot necessarily be predicted, and potentially this way of focusing on the interaction and the readership of the map allows some sort of a loophole in the dilemma of being the authoritarian displayer of information.
You said something very interesting, that you're not, with the game, you're not trying necessarily to map spatial relations or necessarily give indications of space. And this was something I also tried there. I don't even have a cartographic base. But thinking back a bit to, let's say, colonial period and the act of mapping, I think that we tend to fall in the idea that yeah, they were mapping because of navigation, they were mapping to understand the terrain, but there is an underlying agenda to all of that. And I think our selection for the Treasury Room tries to make that explicit. And I think that, well, if we're talking about extractive or land regimes, then of course it's easy to portray these things by drawing territory or by drawing mineral reserves, things like that. But then maybe going back to Johnny's work, I think today we deal with the complexity of post-colonial regimes that require us to draw the undrawable somehow. And maybe you can tell us a little bit just about the process. How do you go about mapping? I mean, I think your detective board, if I may there, tries to give a sense of how this process is multi-angled, but how do you choose what we can draw to, let's say, almost show the channels through which these systems are operating from?
To be honest, I would say that it was emotionally charged and quite biased, but I embraced that because I used the work as a kind of in a more of an activistic role to unveil certain layers of oppression and injustice. But yeah, I was also faced with this issue of like this framing of you need to map this, right? Like your references about all the graduation projects or the things that you see around here are always in this format. So you're constantly up this pressure to map this way. So that's why I started to defer from the map and try to diversify on a spread or within a kind of chapter, different ways in which we understand these spatial relationships. I did, however, use diverse sources, so reports from NGOs, from questionable sources, social media, but in fact, I experimented with GIS, tried to kind of spatially orient these things on a projection. And that was really interesting because I was mapping the unmappable in some sense and found new relationships. So in fact, of course, there's a critical aspect of mapping, but for me, I was able to unveil things that I would never understand before, which actually deemed useful for some NGOs that actually wanted to use the work. So it was really, I mean, it was a bit of a chaotic experience, I would say, trying to just find data and find data that was relevant. And also that question of relevancy and credibility, like who deems your data or the data that you're dealing with credible or relevant, right? So usually these are agents of power, usually connected to colonial structures or post-colonial structures. So I think going forward, I always think about like, this map always has a bias, and you have to be honest about it. Like, you can say as much as you want that this is objective, but it always is a reflection of the knowledge or the data holders or the people that control your information that you're mapping, let's say. Kind of went on a rant, but I don't know if I answered. Yeah.
So I think an interesting perspective that we had maybe on bringing it back to, like, I kind of feel like it relates. I'm not sure entirely. But I mapped with some student, like some associates of mine. We mapped the Panama Canal, and we made a drawing actually that wasn't really close to a map. It was more close to a diagram, and it was more about relating. It was kind of letting go maybe of the innate like notion of being perfectly accurate, but it was more about mapping the whole infrastructure that facilitates kind of transport. We already knew there was a type of problem arising from the Panama Canal because of extensive drought, so the canal was kind of being diversified. And we thought about this as kind of, okay, we can deduce this from afar, so what's the point? And then once we started to go to Panama and actually talk to architects, we noticed they have no overview at all of what's happening. And we also noticed the very limited and very fractured ownership of the canal and how it operates in the landscape. So kind of presenting, for us, maybe a very subjective map / schema to these people was actually very, allowed them to say like, crap, there's an overview, there's a logic, there's something operating. So our perspective as an outsider and our subjective perspective of not having any say in that debate was also very interesting for them, because they end up being, in Panama, there's a lot of speculative housing markets. There's a lot of isolation of architectural firms, so there's no cross the disciplinary sort of debate. So the moment we start to kind of show, okay, this is a very cross-disciplinary relation, they kind of see like, crap, I can talk to all the architects, So that's also very interesting, kind of more social, as also the actual artifact of the map can kind of trigger that. So I still think it has agency, also just has a product. So yeah, it's an interesting insight.
Maybe what could be interesting in there is like also, I want to say if anybody from the audience has a question, then we can also slowly open up the discussion. But I think the interesting thing that you touch on is I think also what brings us to new types of maps, because I think what you also see is a lot of different maps have this kind of systems character to it, and it feels like that the mapping is almost a form of creating a knowledge about what are the constituents of the system that makes it work the way it works. And it's also a process of constructing the map. It's like reconstructing the system also. And I think, of course, when we talk more about, let's say, Anthropocene contexts and post-colonial contexts in which we operate, I think then it's also one of the main paths to figure out how could you possibly do something on a kind of designerly architectural urban planning scale within these transformations, And I think that's, I don't know, I just want to invite everybody maybe a bit outside the circle to join also, but because I feel like this is, for me it's symptomatological. It signifies that something is going on with, let's say, how we think about design, the scale on which we operate, and a new type of knowledge that we need to create. And in a sense, it's literally, like when we construct this map, it feels like we're fishing for this kind of knowledge that transgresses our disciplinary boundaries. And I open this up, let's say, as a very honest question, because I also sometimes like to figure out, okay, what does it actually mean? How, you know, even as teachers, what can we do about it? As a PhD researcher, what actually am I doing here? No, do I get a PhD in architecture, in map making, in transdisciplinarity, in sociology, geology? And why is it even, you know, why does it have to be like trans and multidisciplinary? Why are our problems suddenly so multi-leveled? And, you know, just as an open question, I think there's something very valuable to be learned in it, but I think it's also a very open question, like, what's actually going on here? You know, like, what is happening?
But you say that our problems are suddenly multifaceted, or they're not. They've always been. I think now we're gaining insight into the fact that we need to start looking at things as a layered entity and not as isolated. And I'd say that applies to mapping, designing, existing. I think really understanding things as this convergence. And I think this is why we also see a diversity of representations, really trying to draw these connections. And then maybe I can expand, I don't know, maybe there are other people also who did the motherboard map. This is yours also, right? I'm curious because you said that this really becomes somewhat of an instrument to deal with citizens or to make explicit things. I wonder if a part of them looking at the map isn't like, yikes, this looks complicated, because it looks like, I say, then, yeah, it's...
Would you like the microphone? Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, it was fellow architects, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
No, okay, then I rest my...
But I think that's also an audience, you know, that's also...
No, it's...
And it's definitely some audience you can talk to, and you also have to acknowledge your position as an architect.
No, I'm not saying that that's, but I still think that I'm curious to see how this would operate within
a public.
Yeah, the real world of
yeah, sure, me too. You know.
No, but yeah, we can expand. Yeah.
So, talking about multidisciplinarity, I'm a very lost electrical engineering student, and of course, a motherboard type map speaks to me. And it happens quite often that when I design a chip and generate a circuit that looks incredibly complicated and is very detailed and very abstract, and I sometimes show it to my roommates or to my fellow students that don't study electrical engineering and have no idea what they're looking at, they can make interpretations and give ideas in their in the structure of the layout that I would never interpret. So personally, I think that you don't even need to know all the details or all the specifics of the image or picture you're looking at to draw conclusions from them that are actually useful. So.
I think that's super interesting, and also I would agree, but then there's maybe different types of mapping or cartography. Like there's the act of cartography that is very complex, and it shows complex systems, and the maps look complex also visually. And you can still extract valuable information from that, even if you're not in the same discipline. But then in practice, I feel like there's a different cartography maybe that is much more simple, that creates simpler maps. And this is also very difficult. So our maps at the faculty are almost like artworks sometimes. They look beautiful, they're incredibly intelligent. But can they be more simple? Can they be even more readable, or maybe show less, so that it really resonates with a broader amount of people?
I think that's a super interesting point, because it seems what you're saying, okay, they're not functioning as a map anymore, right? They're more like, okay, read the pattern or something. But I have the following always thought in my mind, that the map at some point used to be the information. So if you wanted to have access to the geospatial information, you needed the map, right? Now the map as an object of representation with the geospatial information, they are not, overlapping. You have the geospatial information. For example, your phone doesn't need the map as a representation to tell you where to go. You need it because you know how to read the map, right? The car, for example, a driverless car could drive itself without the map, just with the information, right? The Iron Dome in Israel could operate without the map, just with the geospatial information. Or a drone could kill someone without the map, with the geospatial information, right? The pilot needs to read probably the map, right? So I have this question, to what extent maybe the importance of maps as something that operates outside the function of information, right, is introducing a new paradigm in cartography, right? And it also allows us to make these maps that they don't really perform their function, right? No one can read them, but you really need to read it. If you need the information, you have access to the information. That's fine, right?
Can I just say that I completely agree, because if you think also about the title of the exhibition, it's about map and narratives. And it is exactly the second word that I feel more into. I think I'm not an instrument to design a real objective, or let's say complete map, especially about the topic I'm dealing with, because it brings geological information, engineering information, a lot of multidisciplinary knowledge. It's about trying to define a kind of narrative, making visible something, also in a very simple and in a very simple way. It's even not collective, I would say. It's a very personal, I'm sorry for that. It's very personal, but it could open up a discussion. It could become an inventory for other person. And so in this sense, it's just one step, a first word of a narrative that should involve many people, like starting a discourse with only one word, and then you can go on with your personal language, let's say. I really trust in it, yes.
Can I maybe add something to it? Because recently I also went to Peru, actually. I was producing a map that was looking at Lima, and Lima is the capital of Peru, and it's usually not associated with any type of heritage or Indian population, because that's usually Cusco. That's the capital of the Incas, and they were all living in the Andes. But what's very interesting is that the research I was working for found that originally the municipality allocated 150 ancient sites that were in Lima, but the research found it was about 400, dating back to about 5000 BC. So you're dealing with a lot of Indian burial grounds basically in a city that just are left unacknowledged. And I was tasked with creating an animation also, not a static map like one of these, but one that kind of pulls through, because you're able to map also multiple sort of successions. So you're kind of, it also becomes more easily to read for people who just pass by. And it became, the data set was really simple. It was just what sites from what time and irrigation channels. And just being able to map that was, in that context, unheard of. It was a world that had not been opened up. And actually, so in that sense also the simplicity of it made it so incredibly powerful. It's not about mapping more and more complicated things. It's about finding something really interesting and being able to concisely state that and just disrupt the whole conversation or just create a whole new intervention?
I can, let's say, provoke you. I mean, my map was not about something interesting, anything interesting, let's say. It was exactly that point for me. It was about mounds of earth that nobody care about. But indeed, my thinking is that they are affecting a lot our landscapes. So the landscape were made of spoils arising from the construction of a huge infrastructure, the transit. So usually maps are dealing with the infrastructure. The railway, also in Switzerland, they started mapping the national Switzerland starting from the infrastructure. But what about if we change perspective and we map starting from the waste that is provoked by the construction of the infrastructure itself? So the monument, in my case, was not the real architecture or the more visible things, but the less considered things. And also the topic of time that you were mentioning was very, very much interesting because we deal with kind of geo-accelerated landscapes made by very fast growing of artificial mountains, very high, or new topographies of villages. But they are actually made by technicians or, let's say, also the material that is produced most of the time is like a technical, kind of technical material. So it's difficult also to be read from people and also from architects, let's say. So. Yeah, if I would, I think that we are really much expanding our topic as a designer, as architect, and at least there's a huge attempt to deal with very complex sites. I'm curious to see if someone would consider somehow my maps as a base for something else. This would be extremely interesting for me, extremely interesting.
But I think what was also interesting in the first part, of your answer is I think you also already hinted at it by saying that is a certain change where maps were traditionally used to locate something in space, and now maps or making cartographies almost becomes a way to situate yourself.
Yeah.
And situate your concern or materialize a matter of concern or something. So for me, that in a sense also implies a completely methodological transformation. Why we even do maps in some sense, because let's say the complex is so complicated that doing this grounds you somewhere, grounds you in a certain flow, grounds you in a certain community, history, that then allows you to disrupt them and so on. And that's why I mean, I didn't put it up there, but let's say my favorite statement is from philosopher Rosi Braidotti, who always says cartography is a way that allows you for, let's say, a theoretically informed and politically powered transformation in the present. And it becomes, in a sense, a precondition to be able to situate yourself and not take things at face value, because you are actually able to unearth something in these processes. And I think, in a sense, as you say, that it allows you to either look at waste or something that people don't recognize to suddenly become part of the story, to reveal a different history, to deal different actors also.
I really liked when you talked about the narrative part, because I think that, and I know that you deal with a very specific set or a very technical set of data to produce your map. And I'm also curious to, how do we use others or maps from others to rewrite new stories? Like, is that possible? How do you use a base that, or is it a reappropriation somehow? Because I think that, yes, you have your personal motivations to tell a very particular story there, but this was something I think Nico's also mentioned, how it becomes this sort of bridge, right, between an analytical set of information, and even though, yes, there will always be a bias as being the form giver to this map, putting it out in, let's say, the world, this becomes somehow another set, and it can, so I'm also curious, I don't know if any of the works here, I mean, all of them work, but I wonder how it would be to map on top of a map somehow. Maybe, I think, dealing with the post-colonial context, it's already this sort of, yeah, then you can talk about projections. There are really different projections working here, so this gave me, I mean, yeah, do you?
Thank you very much. I wasn't going to say anything, but now I just can't resist it. Picking up on your comments about narrative and the map upon the map and new stories. So I'm a literature professor in South Africa, an English literature professor. And one of the things that is really interesting for me to try to explain to the students is what happens when you use the English language to try to evoke an African landscape. And so what I have done in the past is have a map of Africa, but just the outline of South Africa on the board, but then project onto that a 19th century British landscape painting and say, well, what's the dissonance here? Or then you can project a photograph of a South African landscape onto it. And so then you can see here are English writers using an English literary tradition and the politics of representation to speak about something that doesn't quite fit the map. And then I always like to come back to Baudrillard, who says, well, c'est la différence entre le map and the difference between the territory and the map that makes the poetry and the charm of the real.
Yeah, and I would also add also, following this kind of poetry, let's say, input, also the mistakes. I really love to find mistakes, and I want just to quote and tell you as a base for my map, there was this very inspiring map made by a geologist that maybe you know, Rudolf Staub. It was the first making the section through the Alps, no? And I was wondering and asking myself how to represent a geologic movement. And indeed, he made a lot of mistakes in his drawings, but he was very effective in transmitting the movement. And yes, and I found it's very interesting to me, this topic. And there are a lot of other examples, probably, also dealing with what you said.
Maybe to also open up the discussion towards the narrative part that you stressed. I think that's also super interesting because I feel like part of this kind of thing that we're grappling with is also the construction of, let's say, new visions, new narratives, new possibilities even, or like for life and living and so on. And in that regard, sometimes, I don't know, but maybe I'm then conservative actually, because sometimes I feel like that some of these ancient types of maps that I was showing, they always dealt with like extremely ephemeral situations and not just like clinging on to some type of memory, be it social memory, a spatial memory, how people then use these even rock paintings to inscribe their landscape with social memory. So for me, it's a type of mapping, no? The way that quipus may have served as an mnemotechnic device to transmit genealogies or so would for me work on the same level as a planar projection or so. And I feel like when we rethink the map as a cultural technology to sustain these memories or so, I feel like then sometimes these discrepancies, they all come together, because what we're trying to do is, in a sense, we try to understand change, we memorize it, they become a mnemonic device to deal with the change and foster this transformation, but also make it, in a sense, what do we always say, reproducible, so it has to retain, in a sense, the memory of the change. And that's why I wonder, let's say, if we really open it up towards this kind of level of, let's say, cultural technologies, that would, of course, be the perfect faculty to study this. But I was wondering then what you think about, let's say, this narrative dimension, and if there's still some sort of, whatever, is the story changing?
So I'm also interested in how Kiara and Robert talk about how you situate yourself after all those mapping exercises, because there was a time that I might decide that I will never post and publish the maps because of the political difficulty. And I'm also have a feeling very personal when I review the map back from the very old folder of the computer. It's like it's kind of you have a piece of the memory you still have to contribute for your family or for your friends from the place where you live. And also, I kind of have a feeling that map may also have a lifetime, because if I don't really publish them, they will eventually die out, and no one got a piece of this cultural technology and the archive of the memory. So I can also feel the change of the narrative from when I'm joined that in the protest and after the protest, because after it no longer is a tool for getting in or out, but it is more like a documentary of how the city dynamics died out and also going live again. It's like a death and afterlife process when you try to abandon the mass for a period of time and then suddenly take it out because of some things that surrounding you has changed already. So I think map can also have a lifetime that we can pinpoint ourselves in different locations of the history.
I have something to add to that, but also to your question about the agency of our narratives through the progression of time. How throughout history maps were done in different ways, from the selection of the ink to the material that is being inscribed on, and now fast forward to the future with geographic information systems. I think that this subjectivity, and it ties back to what we were trying to say in the beginning, but this subjectivity in the narrative still exists even with this highly advanced technology. And the essence of this exhibition is in the diversity of abstraction and complexities of the map. It goes from a wide range, and I think my map is on the end of depicting reality. It's just a topographic map right over there, showing different elevations and patterns of habitation. But even in this, there is a subjectivity. Even if it's just representing data and topographic lines, it is in the thickness of those lines, the shadows, where the lines turn white to accentuate the crevices that depict how natural forces and human forces have shaped the crevices, the inundations of the coastline. This was the purpose of this map. So even in the depiction of basic data, which is what Nikos was trying to say, it's not just about the map, it's the coordinates and it's the numbers and the invisible data, and what we choose to do with it results in this subjective narrative, which even in the basic depiction of reality still exists. This map could have looked completely different if I chose a 0.5 different thickness for the contour lines, accentuating something else.
I'm thinking now that we're all dealing with very real roles here, and also because somehow there is an interest or a motivation behind all the maps shown here. I'm curious to how maps can fabricate roles that don't really exist, or can they be used? I mean, I think we're all very committed to reality here, very responsible, but I'm curious, is there or are there examples where maps are used, let's say, to produce these or to impose certain orders? Yes, I know there are examples, but I think we're all talking about the agency of it in a quite, let's say, positive and to promote justice somehow, or to explicit regimes which we think are very at the shadows still. But I wonder if it's used as almost a simulative device, as in you can project something and then revert the process instead of drawing something or pointing out something that is done, trying to achieve something by first mapping it. And this is just something I'm thinking, because I think we're all dealing with very real worlds and problems here.
Does anyone want to respond something directly to that? Because I just want to ask something, but there's not going to be the perfect moment to ask that. I myself have not really actually mapped so much during, or worked with maps in that sense during my architecture academia times. But I, of course, admire it, and I was part of working on this, and I love to do that. But I do have to ask, why is it us doing this? Why is it architects or urbanists or the people who follow courses that are offered in this building? Do we want to be cartographers? What do cartographers do? Do they not do this? Or why can they not do this? I don't have an answer to that. It's very much open into the room, but I know that the people that are here are those that deal a lot with this. So well, I'm curious.
How do I say this? I think architects are sort of these, we have this weird relation to the future. We have this kind of weird relation of making objects that will exist in the future. And for that, we need to kind of understand our present condition very much. So then we kind of start to, but of course in the future there's sort of this active projection that we are taking, and this active projection kind of comes from our own sensibilities. So when we are creating a map, we want it to be both sort of, it needs to kind of both be reasonably existent, because when we make an object, it needs to kind of come, or like at some point make these interesting relationships which make this object architectural or particular. So we need to kind of have this basis, but at the same time there's this poetics of kind of creating a world in which this object can start to exist. And I think therefore also the notions that we start to engage more and more in, we cannot take a landscape for granted as just a slab of figure ground, a bunch of buildings slapped together, but there's actual other processes that we are intervening with by solely building. You know, we are now more and more aware of how our existence, just being born, influences other territories in the earth. And it's, I think, therefore a really wonderful method to uncover physically what kind of these consequences are, what the relationships are, because they are very systemic, but they're hard to kind of get to almost a physical point, with a lot of the debate also going on being, you know, hard to kind of ground. So the map kind of becomes, you know, because you're mapping the ground, you are really talking about its physicalities, its impact. And even then, if you're philosophizing, you're kind of bringing it back to a sort of very rooted nature. And I think that's kind of why that becomes kind of very important.
But we do often work with products that people in other professions have made. If I got this right, you are trying to sort of say that we want to understand, as an architect, want to understand the world in certain ways, and therefore we also want to map the world in certain ways, because it allows us to then think ahead into the future better. Is that roughly the point?
No, it just allows us to create different narratives from a pre-existing point of view. And we have to be very careful with kind of accepting the narratives, because if we just take maps given to us, we already have people who give those maps with certain intentions. So we are aware of the agency that architecture can have by re-understanding not only the system we produce, like because we make a system with a building, but also the system through which our perception or our previous understandings of something is produced.
And you personally, would you consider working in both fields strongly, cartography or making maps, you know, producing this, because this is a full-time job at the end of the day, or will you also then produce the buildings? Do you think the profession splits into two parts or multiple?
I am very, like, I work also as a digital artist. So what I find really wonderful about, like, and a lot of digital art nowadays becomes object-oriented and becomes node-based. So you start to generate stuff with certain operations. And I think also the map is kind of part of kind of starting to generate with certain operations, and then get a system, and then the system you design for the map kind of informs how you start to then create with that. So it's maybe not even as maybe Nikos said before, it's like this information doesn't need a map, but the map is kind of a put out of that thing. So there's also this inverted pyramid of how you understand that knowledge and then how you generate a new architectural invention from that. And I've actually personally really fostered that relationship and really work with it.
Sorry. Oh, well, okay. I don't know if there is a way of doing this. You said, how is it, do you see yourself working in both fields? I don't think it's necessary, like this thick line between that. Because maps, I really agree with everything what Luisa said and right now what you said, because I think it's crossovers thinking that building is just a part within a system, it's a layered system. And for us as architects, we are really visual people as well. We draw a lot. And I think map becomes this really clear base for the project, because you don't want to have just an object, right? Like, I think nowadays the architects are thinking above that. It's not just about this one thing, end result. It's what it can actually start after or within this, you know? And the map is a base and a way for us to understand the context of your design. At least that's how I see it.
I also feel like we as architects kind of like to communicate a lot, and we do have to communicate a lot with people from kind of different disciplines, and also with, let's say, people who would be potentially living in our spaces. So we kind of almost have to learn how to communicate things, not only within our field, not only within people from our field, but also from other fields. And for me, it's that has to do a lot about this literacy of how we're capable to also translate that kind of information that sometimes is very kind of complex and very raw and statistical. Although I also see a danger in that sense that because it is so kind of raw and very straightforward, sometimes it feels like it's very right. And I think that I like to unfold or try to criticize that rightness in it. That I think it was also mentioned before that we kind of rely on the data that is available for us online. It really depends on every country and their own policies of what they are making it public and what not. So I think for me it also, at least I try to not generalize it and kind of, I also like to bring it down to the level of how we just approach a space and how we see it visually ourselves. How do we see the space, how we hear, how we sense it. And I think that's why I also love to go back to this historical context of how first mappers or geographers were trying to map the space really visually in physical kind of sense. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think that makes total sense. And what I was also wondering, based on what you said, and like in regards to your question, is also like I started to overthink your question a bit, because you mentioned like, do we then want to become cartographers also? But would you ask the same question when you make a site model, and then would you ask people, do you want to be a model maker? When people engage with ethnographic research, do you ask them, do you want to be an ethnographer rather than architect? So I think the point is, in a sense, the interesting thing is I think that I think people that make maps choose a methodology that tries to understand a certain level of complexity and scale, and then we practice this analysis in the same way as maybe if you're very interested in making really interesting spatial geometry, then you work in a model. If you want to understand a really complex data relationship, then you do that with a certain program that I don't know. But so I feel like it's more like a kind of a choice. So if you have a tendency to work with maps, I think it also says something about yourself, some kind of. So it's not necessarily you want to work as a cartographer, but maybe, yes, you deal with, let's say, huge problems of migration and how to address that architecturally. You deal with colonial systems or your colonial violence. You try to deal with vast-scale ecological transformations. And then, of course, yeah, you can't really solve that maybe with circular buildings, but at least the question is, like, what would you need it for? And what do you want to learn from it, I think. And I think that's the newness, in a sense, for me, comes in not in necessarily promulgating like a new type of map that we should all do, or whether or not we should all do maps. But I think it has something to do with the sensibility that you cultivate by looking at space through maps, what you can achieve with that, or where you situate yourself as an architect through maps. And then the question that I would, let's say, take away from this discussion today is we could think about as a faculty if we offer enough guidance in that, if we offer enough courses, literature, theoretical background, where when we realize, okay, there seems to be a shift where this becomes increasingly valuable for everybody, we could look in maybe facilitating more courses and with cartographers, with literary specialists, and with material specialists, with computer scientists, to maybe actually figure out these biases that we have, so that the map is not the territory, and that maps don't necessarily have to be spatial, but can also be temporal, and they can be processual and so on. And just discover that as like a very fun thing together. But I think we're about to have to close the session. So since there were no questions, or hopefully, I mean, if there's still questions, we can still bring them in. But otherwise, what I would say is let's just discuss informally all the great things that we still want to say. And maybe let me thank you, everybody, and please help me thank everybody for the fascinating discussion today.
Thank you very much. I kept thinking, I think we are already offline. One of the reasons that brought me to mapping is one article by James Corner, with whom I work for a long time, The Agency of Mapping. I hope that these maps makes us more agents than we already are. Some of the maps that or the works that we saw here, or we are seeing here today, are more agents than others. I appreciate very much some of the works that actually engage some of the authors really personally, is their lives brought into those maps. So I really would thank those maybe a little bit more. And let's remember that mapping, or what we do here, not mapping, but what we do here at the faculty, should not remain an elitist activity. And I have the impression every time we end up here at the PK Talks that a group of us, of elitist, privileged students and faculty, are dealing with problems that are not so elitist. And I have the impression that we tend to forget that. This is a little bit what I try to do when we communicate things outside academia. No? In the end, there are some maps there that talk about the life and the death of people. So I would like you to always remember that it's not that you have discovered something super cool in Panama, that you're dealing with the lives of people. And let's not forget that. That's a certain agency to the work that you do beyond the coolness of it. And don't take me wrong. Thank you.
Thank you.